Good afternoon and welcome to St George's Hall for this, the third Roscoe event of the University's bicentenary year. I'm Professor Mark Power, the Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive of Liverpool John Moores University, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker here today. During this 200th anniversary year for the University, we are commemorating milestones and celebrating the key moments in our institutional history. Many of those milestones are truly historical. 50 years of sports science, 175 years of pharmacy, and 200 years of arts and technology. We often reference Roscoe as one of our founding fathers, and this evening we are celebrating one of the most significant movements in our recent and modern history, the Roscoe Lectures. Very few of us were around when some of those discipline-focused milestones began, but in 1997, I remember distinctly, and I'm sure I'm not alone, the launch of the Roscoe Lectures as the university's first public lecture series founded by Lord David Alton. Roscoe fans may well remember that David has presented a lecture previously, and in 2009, sandwiched between Louis Moreno Ocampo and Richard Stilgo, which certainly gives you a flavour of the eclectic role of call of presenters we've been privileged to hear, David presented his own lecture, Gladstone, Son of Liverpool, Scourge of the Tyrants. David retired from the university in 2016, and I am pleased to say his legacy continues to this day, with our own public lecture series, simply known as the Roscoes. So in our bicentenary year, I approached David to return and give us his reflections of 25 years of the characters, thoughts and ideas that have shaped and continue to inform the Roscoe series. I invited David out to lunch wondering whether this was going to be a difficult ask, but he'd agreed before the starters arrived. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor the Lord David Alton to present our 169th lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you. Vice-Chancellor, Lord Grantchester, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as I walked down the corridor this evening, it felt as though I was embarking on an episode of All Our Yesterdays or reminiscences in the reflective mode of maybe a Radio 4 program. It was so nice to meet people I encountered who have been here from the beginning, who've been such supporters of the Roscoe Lectures. It set the scene for me, certainly, in an admirable and very helpful, very enjoyable way. Of course, this hall has great memories for me for all sorts of reasons. While I was a student here in Liverpool, just before my finals, in a little part of the hall at the back here, they counted the votes from one small Liverpool ward called Low Hill. And much to everybody's amazement, including mine, I found myself elected to be the local councillor for Low Hill. It was here in 1979 that I became the youngest member of the House of Commons and the shortest lived as well, for 2.5 days after the government had lost the vote of no confidence, and subsequent votes during my nearly 20 years serving the city as a member of the House of Commons. Those counting of votes took place on many occasions in this place. So there are all sorts of memories, but perhaps most important of all were the memories that begin with the Roscoe Lectures, as Mark has said, in 1997. Mark has given me this invidious task of reflecting on the origins of the Roscoe Lectures and to try and highlight some of the key moments in a public lecture series that has no recent rival in terms of scale or breadth. I oversaw, I think, over 140 of them, and as Michael Brown, who's here tonight with his wife Andrea, will testify, I think I missed one through ill health on one occasion. So I do recall these lectures, and many of them are described in this wonderful little book produced by Liverpool John Moores. And if you want to fill in the detail, because I can't talk about every single one of the lectures, on the website there is a very good overview of those lectures. Some of the people who are here tonight were at the very first of those lectures. Rob McLaughlin, who became the political editor of Granada TV and who did the job that you're going to do, Ganesha, later on today, of Q&A. That was at the Liverpool Town Hall, a lecture entitled Educating for Citizenship. Now, I always cautioned lecturers not to go on too long and to leave time for questions, advice I'll try and follow tonight. On one occasion, in 2022, the constraints of time were demonstrated by a large prop. We'd filled Liverpool Philharmonic Hall to hear Ken Dodd lecture on the place of humour in sustaining us in dark times. Ken was well known for keeping audiences laughing for hours beyond the advertised finishing time. On several occasions, I'd explained to him that the Philharmonic's orchestra had a rehearsal in the hall after we'd finished, and that we'd organised a dinner to celebrate his birthday, and that we needed to end on time. Well, as we came out onto the stage, Ken headed over to the side, and behind the curtains he pulled out a wheelbarrow. First of all, he put on a gown and a mortarboard, and then in the wheelbarrow, which he wheeled onto the stage, was a very large egg timer. Now, without uttering a word, he placed it on the table next to me, and as the sand began to work its way through, he simply looked at the audience, who immediately saw the joke at my expense, and they, of course, roared with laughter. One of the great lawyers at the Nuremberg trials, Lord Burkitt, a brilliant advocate and humane judge, once told his audience, "I do not object to people looking at their watches when I'm speaking, but I strongly object when they start shaking them to make certain that they're still going." So tonight, in the absence of Ken Dodd's egg timer, I'll be on the lookout for the shaking of watches. Now, the rule of three is a very powerful technique or principle used in public speaking. Shirley Williams used it in her Roscoe lecture in the Blue Coat Chambers, saying that as Gaul had been divided into three parts, she would do the same. The point is that any ideas, thoughts, events, characters, or sentences that are presented in threes are said to be more effective and more memorable. So let me outline the elements of my remarks tonight as being threefold. Why, who, and what? Why did we launch for Roscoe's? Who did we want to give the lectures? And what do I hope will be their future and legacy? So why first? Intending to stand down at the House of Commons in 1997, I'd undertaken a visiting fellowship at St Andrews University and began work on a new book on citizenship. As an MP, I had supported Peter Toyn's ambitious ideas for Liverpool Polytechnic to become a homegrown university. The city owes a huge debt to Peter on many fronts, and I'm thrilled that he is here tonight. Peter had discussed the creation of a foundation for citizenship, and with the generous help of the Liverpool lawyer, Rex Makin, and it's also wonderful to see his widow, Shirley, here tonight, the foundation was established. Although LJMU's a new institution, it actually had its origins in 1823 and the creation of the Liverpool Mechanics Institute and College of Art, hence the celebration tonight of the bicentenary. The Institute's 1823 mandate was that education is the key to progress, something I believe myself passionately, being the first from either side of my family ever to have the opportunity, thanks to the 1944 Education Act, of a higher education. Now, one of the founders in 1823 of the Liverpool Mechanics Institute was William Roscoe, and we have a descendant of William Roscoe in the audience tonight. The Institute ran public lectures and classes which explored the arts, the humanities, technology, engineering, the science of medicine, physiology, and philosophy. And you know, up to 1,400 people attended them. 11 years after its foundation, in 1844, an up-and-coming young novelist called Charles Dickens gave a lecture at the Institute, and he said this to his audience: "It's a delight and happiness for me to connect myself with such an institute as this." Dickens's brilliant biographer, Claire Tomlinson, gave a Roscoe lecture here in St. George's Hall in 2012 to commemorate another bicentenary, the anniversary of Dickens's birth. We even discovered a letter he'd sent from the Adelphi Hotel in which he said how wonderfully welcoming the people of Liverpool had been, but how awful the acoustics had been in St. George's Hall. Always a challenge, but I'm very pleased to see our sound engineers are doing their best to grapple with. So a public lecture series, 174 years after the foundation of the Mechanics' Institute, seemed like a perfect piece of symmetry. But there was more to it than that. From the very start, LJMU has been ambitious to be more than an army of occupation in the city's civic life. But it wasn't an easy time. In 1997, we had to face the consequences of a turbulent and discordant period where respect for differing views had often been replaced by anger and by intolerance. If nothing else, by inviting lecturers with differing opinions, we hoped we could open up a respectful space, but also introduce the visiting speakers to real Liverpudlians and Merseysiders rather than the media caricatures. It was a point reflected by Melvyn Bragg when I showed him this hall. "But where will the lecture be?" he asked. "In here," I replied. "But how many are you expecting?" "Around 1,000 tickets are out." He gasped and said, "But will they listen? Will there be trouble?" he asked tentatively. I was struck that even broadcasters used to speaking into microphones or to cameras reaching millions of people can be intimidated by large public audiences. Barbara Mace, who's here and of course did more than anybody to organise these events, that very evening had the task of calming down Melvyn Bragg because he found that he'd left his glasses on the train. And Barbara headed off to Lime Street, managed to get down to the carriage 5 minutes before the train was due to depart back to London, found his glasses and brought them back to a very relieved Melvyn Bragg. Now, Melvyn, Roy Jenkins, and many others went away with a very different view of our city, and they became ambassadors in the remaking of Liverpool's reputation and image. The lectures, we thought, would also be a space in which Merseysiders would rub shoulders and strike up conversations with people that they might not otherwise come into contact with. The former Lord Lieutenant is here tonight, former High Commissioners, judges, people that you wouldn't necessarily get to otherwise have conversations with. From the very start, I wanted the lectures to be varied and unpredictable, but not shy of stimulating, thoughtful debate. They should, I thought, be an example of the university's insistence on academic freedom and free speech. And from the beginning, I wanted to name the lectures for William Roscoe, the father of Liverpool culture, and with a direct line of descent into this world-class university. The great Liverpool historian, James Picton, of whom, of course, the library opposite is named after, said, and I quote, "No native resident of Liverpool has done more to elevate the character of the community by uniting the successful pursuit of literature and art with the ordinary duties of the citizen." He was a man of business. In 1807, Roscoe was briefly elected to the House of Commons, and during the few weeks he sat as an MP, he was able to vote with the abolitionists to end the transatlantic trade. His role helps to redeem the darkest chapter of the Liverpool story. He told the House of Commons, I quote, "I consider it the greatest happiness of my existence to lift up my voice on this occasion with the friends of justice and humanity." On returning to Liverpool, he was beaten up by an angry mob, and after serving for just 3 months, he was never re-elected. In the years that followed, he continued to publish tracts and poems attacking the inhumanity and evil of slavery. In his poem, The Wrongs of Africa, are lines which retain their strength and their poignancy to this day. He said, "Blush ye not to boast your equal laws, your just restraints, your rights defended, your liberties secured, whilst with an iron hand ye crush to earth the helpless African, and bid him drink that cup of sorrow which yourselves have dashed indignant from oppression's fainting grasp." Roscoe, the Unitarian, showed admirable courage as he shunned popular acclaim, vigorously admonishing his Liverpool readers and reminding them that for all of us there comes a time of reckoning. "Forget not, Britain," he said, "higher still than thee sits the great judge of nations who can waive a wrong and can repay." Roscoe's remarkable story, including his role in founding the Botanic Gardens and the Athenaeum, and his links with Lorenzo de' Medici, Leonardo da Vinci, and Roscoe's discovery of that polymath's lost treatise on mechanics, is told on my website. In 2007, we used the anniversary of the abolition of the transatlantic trade to recall both the history of that struggle and the challenge of contemporary modern-day slavery. We heard from the writer Adam Hochschild, from Nicholas Frayling, Anti-Slavery International, from Rebecca Tinsley, the founder of Network for Africa, and Vava Tampa, founder of Save the Congo. Roscoe had a profound love of Africa and would have approved of them all. He was also an accomplished botanist, an early environmentalist, and brought nature to life in his captivating children's poem, The Butterfly Ball, written for his son Robert at their home, Allerton Hall, in which he describes some of the guests at revels in the insect world. And there was the gnat and the dragonfly too, with all of their relations, green, orange, and blue. King George III had the poem set to music for his three daughters, the princesses Elizabeth, Augusta, and Mary. And Roscoe never stopped trying to challenge the infamies of his time. In the last 3 years of his life, we find him busy founding a Liverpool association for superseding the use of children in chimney sweeping, a cause which Lord Shaftesbury would bring to fruition. But in 2023, just bear in mind the scandal of the use of child labour in cobalt mines in Congo, something I've written about this week. So anyway, back in the day, in 1997, I had no doubt that I had the right person and the right name for a public lecture series. And where better to hold them than in an outward-looking city, animated by passionate argument, love of conversation, and quick-witted humour. Of course, there's the famous story of the Liverpool speaker who's speaking and foolishly asks a rhetorical question, not a mistake I've ever made since. "Can you hear me at the back of the hall?" And the inevitable Scouse voice boomed out, "Yes, I can hear you, but I don't mind shifting places with someone who can't." Well, back in 1997, someone who wasn't into humour, but was a skeptic, guffawed and said, this idea of these public lectures was all very well and good, but, he said, the days of the public lecture are over and no one will come. Well, with Peter Toyn's support, I went ahead anyway, and that first lecture got us off to a good start, although my discouraging skeptics said they would trail off after one or two. And what did you say, Mark? 160? There we go. In addition to combining learning and an enjoyable evening out, I hope that by using prestigious venues like this one, complete with its statue of William Roscoe and the Father Willis organ, and thank you, Stephen Derringer, for playing us in with such a familiar theme, that it would open people's eyes to our fine architectural heritage and display the city at its best. But from time to time, it would also showcase some of the academic excellence at LJMU, as with Professor Mike Bode's lecture in 2006, asking whether mankind's future is in space, a theme which was later explored by Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, by Sir Patrick Moore, by Brian Schmidt, by Monica Grady, and David Hilmers, a US astronaut, 4 times in space. And there was a similar collaboration in 2014 with LJMU's history professor, Professor Frank McDonough, when we commemorated the anniversary of the First World War. And we had a full day of World War I poetry, but moving lectures from Bill Sargent and Tony Wainwright about the Liverpool Pals, and the series was rounded off by the first Sea Lord, Admiral Alan West, with contributions as well from Diana Leese, the first female director of the Imperial War Museum, and on a subsequent occasion, Jeremy Paxman lectured on the Great War and on the realities of war, much in our minds today because of Ukraine. And we heard from the former Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Lord Guthrie, from George Robertson, the former head of NATO, and the Duke of Westminster on the role of the Territorial Army. That takes me from the why I founded the lecture series into the who. Who would we invite to give these lectures? Well, over 25 series of Roscoe Lectures, we'd heard from heads of state, cabinet ministers, celebrated academics, cardinals, archbishops, rabbis and imams, ambassadors and diplomats, novelists, biographers, commentators, sportsmen and women, judges, musicians, comedians and entertainers, businessmen and businesswomen, field marshals, generals, admirals, a couple of chief constables and mayors, some peers, a duke, and people who fit no category. Of course, topping the bill, in 2007, I was pleasantly surprised when Kensington Palace told me that Prince Charles would be willing to accept my invitation to deliver a Roscoe Lecture and to accept a university fellowship. In his Roscoe Lecture, the future king reflected on public service. He spoke about the struggle against slavery and told us, and I quote, Roscoe was considered a fool by many to challenge the received wisdom of his day. The prince added that architecture, medicine, agriculture, the environment and education have been adversely affected by the neglect of a particular kind of wisdom that guided our forebears for generation and in expressing mankind's relationship with nature. So public service and citizenship have always been central themes, but there have been others in which we've tried to combine wisdom, the kind that the future king described, and words with action and deeds. So we had the sculptor, Stephen Broadbent, describe his reconciliation statues in 3 vertices of the slavery triangle. And from West Africa, we welcomed here in St. George's Hall President John Kufuor of Ghana and conferred on him the university's highest award. We explored the barriers to diversity with well-judged lectures from Paul Robeson Jr., Baroness Valerie Amos, George Alagiah, who most sadly recently died of bowel cancer far too young, and Trevor Phillips, who reflected on the lessons we could learn from the killing of Anthony Walker, who was aged 18 when he was murdered by a racist attack in Highton. And we heard from Tanny Gray-Thompson about the prejudice and the obstacles faced by people with disabilities. The theme of reconciliation prompted us to bring President Mary McAleese of Ireland and also Senator George Mitchell, who did so much to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement. And movingly, we heard from Colin Parry, whose son Tim was one of the 2 children murdered by the IRA bomb in Warrington in 1993, and from John Alderdice, the former Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. We never shied away from grim reality and terrible tragedy, but also laced with hope. After 4 suicide bombers struck London's transport network, killing 52 people and injuring 770 others, we ran a short series entitled Learning to Live Together, surely still one of the great challenges of our time, learning to live together. And that series featured the Methodist moderator, a Muslim imam, and a Jewish rabbi. On other occasions, we heard inspiring addresses from Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi, from Rabbi Julian Neuberger, the archbishops of Canterbury and York, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, and our own local church leaders. Another former head of state was the Nobel laureate who gave a Roscoe lecture, and that was Poland's Lech Wałęsa, the dockyard electrician from Gdansk, who co-founded Solidarity and brought phenomenal change to his country as it reclaimed its sovereignty from the Soviet Union. Anne Applebaum, in her brilliant account of the Soviet gulags, on another occasion left us in no doubt about the nature of Stalin's Soviet empire, while Ambassador John Everard, who's here tonight, gave us a harrowing account about the nature of crimes against humanity in North Korea, where he served as Her Majesty's ambassador. Justice, the rule of law, and human rights were themes brought to life by lecturers like Sherry Booth KC and Lord Justice Sir Brian Leveson KC, who both served as chancellors of LJMU. And we were inspired by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Louis Marino Ocampo, by Shami Chakrabarti, by Sir Mark Headley, by Helena Kennedy KC, and Patricia Scotland KC, who went on to become Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. And we heard from two distinguished Chief Constables, Lord Hogan Howe and Sir John Murphy. We heard from survivors of Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity, Trudy Levy, Pascal Coutet, and Philomene Ouamalea, whose accounts of Hitler's concentration camps, Burma's atrocities, and Rwanda's genocides were among the inspirations for my most recent book on the crime of genocide. Susan Cohen used a lecture on the life of Eleanor Rathbone to highlight the role of women in politics and the extraordinary achievements of that remarkable Liverpool woman. And we had capacity audiences for Michael Heseltine and Andy Burnham. We heard alternative views on Scottish independence from Alex Salmon and Charles Kennedy. And from frontline politics, we heard from, amongst others, David Blunkett and Anne Widdecombe, Jack Straw, Geoffrey Howe, Douglas Hurd, David Steele, Frank Field, and John Boko, then the Speaker of the House of Commons. And from the Press Gallery in Parliament, we heard the astute observations of Peter Hennessy. Other themes of the Roscoe Lectures have included social issues, homelessness and poverty, addressed by John Bird, the founder of Big Issue, Esther Ranson on child abuse, mental health challenges by Sheila Hollins, cancer, compassion and care from Elora Finlay, and Sir Liam Donaldson, the Chief Medical Officer, on the legacy of Dr. Duncan. On the 4th of June 2008, Liverpool was named Capital of Culture, a title synonymous with Roscoe, often called the father of Liverpool culture. And that was an achievement, Capital of Culture, that Peter Toyne again had a very important part in. And again, we thank you, Peter, for that. During that time, from the world of music and poetry, we heard from Vasily Petrenko, from Roger McGough and Ian Tracy. From the media, we had Peter Sissons, Lord Hall, Charles Allen, Greg Dyke, Joe Riley. From the world of sport, Clive Tilsley and Gerard Houllier. And from gifted writers such as Claire Tomlinson, whom I've mentioned, Sir Simon Jenkins, Brian Appleyard, Frank Cottrell Boyce, and the acclaimed children's writers Michael Mapurgo and Brian Jakes. We invited contributions from the world of business and economics, homing in on ethical and social responsibilities, with lectures from Mark Carney from the Bank of England, Philip Green, John Stadinsky, Sir Peter Middleton, Terry Leahy, John Fleming, Sir Peter Sutherland, and Will Hutton. So much then for the why and the who. What do I hope will be the legacy for the future? There is one remarkable lecture I haven't mentioned that is particularly relevant to the legacy. In 2004, I invited His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama to give a lecture on the art of peaceful coexistence and respect for difference. It was to be held in the Anglican Cathedral, in Liverpool Cathedral, in the presence of leaders of all the great faiths. Thousands applied for tickets. Just 1 week before the lecture, Professor Michael Brown, who will recall the conversation that we had, and Councillor Frank Roderick, who was the Lord Mayor of Liverpool, both received calls from the Chinese Communist Party officials in the Chinese embassy in London. Go ahead, they said, with this lecture with the Dalai Lama, and there will be no more Chinese students for your university. Go ahead, and the twinning of Liverpool and Shanghai will be severed. What did I think? I said that when a Chinese gunboat arrived in the Mersey, we should get worried, but capitulating to blackmail and to threats would merely give encouragement to the bully. Besides, unlike the rules that apply in a one-party, totalitarian state, we believe in an institution like this, in academic freedom and free speech. So the lecture went ahead with a waiting list of 1,000 people. The Dalai Lama said in his lecture this: whether we agree with each other or have differences, we have to live on this planet together as a human society. The reality is we are heavily interconnected and interdependent. In the years that followed that lecture, I've travelled to Tibet, to Western China, where I met Uyghur Muslims who are now subjected to genocide. I went to Taiwan, which faces daily military intimidation, and was part of the international team that in 2019 monitored the last free elections in Hong Kong. I love and respect Chinese people and civilization, but not the ideology and the cruelty of the CCP. I worry about their subversion of our institutions, not least our universities, about their influence and the intimidation which they use against exiled Hong Kongers. So I often think about the words of the Dalai Lama and the essence of free speech and academic freedom, which are encapsulated in the spirit of these Roscoe Lectures. Friends, in an age of no platforming, of hate speech, of political correctness, PC, rather than political courage, PC, of the overuse of flaccid language, of rights without reference to responsibilities, obligations, and duties, and the absence of respect for others and respect for difference, I hope that the legacy of William Roscoe and the lectures named for him will live on in that spirit for many years to come. And I hope the why, the who, and the what have somehow fulfilled some of your expectations for this evening. Earlier, and we're coming to the end, and there will be, I think, the opportunity for you to then throw questions, and no doubt, like previous Roscoe lectures, I'll try and dodge each and every single one of them. But earlier, I mentioned the poem, The Butterfly Ball, which William Roscoe wrote for his son, Robert. It concludes by reminding his children that even festivities have their end. Their watchman, the glowworm, came out with a light. Then home let us hasten, while yet we can see, for no watchman is waiting for you and for me. So said little Robert, and pacing along, his merry companions returned in a throng. Well, less prosaically, and in the absence of Ken Dodd's Egg Timer, I'm a fan of the Marx Brothers, and I recall that in one of their films, Chico is pounding away furiously at the piano. Meanwhile, the aptly named Groucho looks on impatiently. Chico continues, regardless, to pound away at the keys. Finally, he says to Groucho, "I can't think of the ending." And Groucho replies, "I can't think of anything else." And you'll be relieved to know, nor can I. Thank you for listening.